And now I go to Andrew Gardner. Andrew, take us to the Gulf, take us to the Arabian shores, and tell us what life is from as an anthropologist, and how do you think we need to view these things? Thanks, Andrew. You have the floor.
Shabari, thank you so much for this moderation, and I'm very honored to be a part of this and speaking to you all. I know my time is short, and I have 7 points that I hope to get to in this very brief moment. And so the first thing I'd like to say, as I was listening to Dr. Bilesha, thinking about Sri Lanka and the many Sri Lankan migrants that I've spoken with over the last 2 decades, it really occurred to me that this pandemic that we're all mired in and trying to grapple with at this moment, I think in a few years, it would very much, in the future, it will resemble one of those push factors, one of those factors that continues to push migrants to seek a remuneration from the Gulf states. And so I guess I'm thinking about also our capacity to see this pandemic as yet another in a long sequence of push factors causing the kinds of frictions that drive migration. The second point that I wanted to bring up was that the Gulf cities, the Gulf states, the migration industry that facilitates these movements, all of this is premised on the same global mobility that this virus lives on, right? This virus and this pandemic has traveled on the same conduits and the same routes that we move about this planet on. And just that coincidence, I think, is something that we need to always sort of keep in the back of our mind. Third, I'm sort of shifting to my urbanist perspective here. I think that the pandemic conditions have really shifted some of the fundamental gravity of the urban, right? Our togetherness, our consolidation, our conglomeration in the urban milieu, this has been changed. That proximity is suddenly dangerous, right? And I think it's important to keep that in mind because in the Gulf, especially, so many of the projects that migrants are there to work on are urban projects, right? And so the entire sort of foundational logic of urbanism, I think, has been called into question, at least momentarily, by the presence of this global pandemic. And who knows how that will affect the opportunities for migration, but it's certainly something that I'm keeping an eye on. Fourth, any of us who've ever spent time sort of looking at the situation of migrants in the Gulf states is aware that there is an enclaving and a segregation in the urban space of the Gulf that's very common. Migrants, labor camps, and migrants are usually situated in particular places. I think that we need to look at the spatial politics present in the cities of the Gulf. That's a problem. That is certainly, that kind of segregation seems extremely problematic, but it's also, I think we need to recognize it as a tool, right? By which states are seeking to combat the spread of this virus. And it's a dangerous tool. And I think I am very curious as to how the Gulf states and the cities are going to be navigating the use of this tool in ways that are attentive to the rights and the lives of the migrants who live in these zones, in these districts, and in these spaces. Fifth, I just wanted to briefly mention that I think it's important that we keep in mind the Gulf states are not a homogeneous unit and that there are notable differences between the Gulf states. One of the variables that I'm particularly interested in is, does the relative openness of a state like Qatar, open to research, open to people like me, interviewing and counting migrants, is that openness going to reverberate in the sort of capacity to deal with and cope with this global pandemic? Something I'm curious about. Sixth, and these points I'm drawing from the wonderful talks that we had earlier, I wanted to know, been a lot of questions and a lot of talk about domestic workers or housemaids. And I wanted to note that the very factors that make domestic workers so vulnerable in the kafala or the sponsorship system, their isolation, residence in the households in which they use, the lack of communication with the outside world, strangely, in pandemic conditions, that's also a positive, right? That insulates them from the kind of crowded conditions that many other South Asian migrants encounter in the Gulf states. And so there's this strange irony with domestic workers, I think, in that their location in the households actually provides them with some modicum of insulation from the vulnerabilities of infection. And then lastly, there's also been a lot of very interesting and valuable talk about irregular migration. And again, I wanted to note that in my own work, and I think others are attentive to this as well, that this irregular migration and this illegality in the sponsorship system in the Gulf states is a two-edged sword, right? Yes, it's illegal and renders migrants more vulnerable to deportation, to certain kinds of exploitation, to state infractions. At the same time, these migrants, many of them who choose to become illegal migrants, are not dupes, structural dupes, to use Anthony Giddens' words. These choices reflect the fact that there are freedoms, right? In a rigid, inflexible labor market, this illegal labor allows migrants to switch between employers. And I'm curious as to how that agility and that flexibility rendered illegally in the labor markets of the Gulf might allow migrants to better navigate the dilemmas of the pandemic in the Gulf states and the cities therein. So there are some of the issues that come to mind in hearing these wonderful talks. And again, Shabari, thank you for your moderation. And I really appreciate this opportunity to share my perspective on the Gulf states.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Andrew. Just noting down your 7 points, push factors. Gosh, how much should we talk about push factors, and how much should we focus on decent work at home? Isn't reintegration about first decent work at home? I'm glad you speak about the urban milieu, the role of cities, because I know that a lot of people in the global migration discourse will say how important cities are in this context. Whether it is interstate migration within India or whether it's international migration, let's not forget these people are coming back to a certain town, to a certain city, to a certain area within a state, and therefore the local governance structure in these places are so pivotal. Thanks for pointing out that Gulf states are not homogeneous, and it's so important for us to keep that in mind. How Qatar would react to UAE is different from how Kuwait would react to Oman. In Oman, perhaps a much more of a common system for people in the Omanis in the workforce than in perhaps other countries. So really, I think that kind of a conversation is very important. I'm glad you pointed out. Of course, we say domestic workers, Andrew, and it's important to keep in mind that these are very important. That brings in the female migration, the women migration, the vulnerabilities that women go through much more than men, perhaps not even as a part of the labor law in a lot of these countries. So it's important to recognize that. So thanks so much, Andrew, for all those points, the 7 points. I think you're my 7 commandment person. Appreciate it, Andrew. Right now,